for in the appendices in the back. So all of our demographics data, economic development data, natural resources, you know, all that other stuff that's required of the growth policy is in the back, in appendices. So you can easily just, if you wanna see what are the housing statistics for, you know, Muscle Shoals County, you just flip to that appendix, and you don't have to flip through a 100-page document and try to find it, you can just flip right to that appendix.
That's great information to have.
Right, so that's how we compile our growth policies, and we found it's a lot easier to find information in it, doing it that way, so anyway, to answer your question, most of the stuff that's in that is going to be in the growth policy. Unless there's something that maybe doesn't apply to Muscle Shoals County, then we wouldn't include it, but most everything should be included.
I don't wanna derail your approach here, but, so the growth policy's one aspect, which to me looked like a pretty serious work effort. And the next is the capital improvement. And maybe, you know, I'm not sure, I guess my initial thought was, how can we do both within this confines of dollars or whatever?
Because we're that good.
Okay, well, good answer.
I mean, that's what we're contracted to do, is to do both of them.
Alright.
And so I think the benefit of doing them both together is the community process, the public process, is we combine them into one process. So you're
Good
not
point.
doing that twice, you're doing it once for both documents. So that helps us a lot. The research, the housing demographics goes into both documents. So we're doing it one time, and they both go into the same document, or two different
I like
documents.
that answer. I mean,
Right, and so we're compiling effort also. So really, when you boil it down to that, a lot of the effort we put into the growth policy spills into the CIP when you're talking about the data.
Yeah,
Then really what we're looking at on the CIP side is just compiling our list of projects that you guys wanna do and prioritizing those projects over the next 10, 20 years, whatever you wanna set that horizon.
based on what the growth policy might say you need to do.
Right. Yeah, well, and the CIP is kind of a little bit, I mean, we do talk about infrastructure and needs in the growth policy, but it's a very high level discussion. And then the CIP is a more, this is your capital program for the next 10 years. Like, this is the project we wanna do in 2026, and it costs this much.
Okay.
So that you can use that document for budgeting, right? So
And
you
maybe
can
for getting
plan.
grants and stuff.
And looking for grants and things like that, right? And so, they're similar documents, but different. The growth policy is a planning document for the county, for different aspects of the county, not just land use, but other things. And then the CIP is specifically capital improvement projects. So, but it could be infrastructure, it could be, facilities projects, it could be equipment. I mean, what we do is we put together so we'll talk to you guys first, then we'll talk to all the departments and figure out what their needs are. And then we compile a big list of projects, or needs, we call them, right? And then we put together a matrix, of those projects, and that goes out to a group of people. You guys, maybe the road department head, DES, you know, whoever, you know, we'll come up with a list of people that you guys want that to do that. They fill out the matrix, which ranks the projects. Then we add all those together, and the average creates your prioritized project list,
Excellent.
right? And so then your prioritized list comes out. Number one is this, 2, 3, 4, down to whatever. And then we sit down with you guys and say, okay, here's your priority list. The next 10-year planning horizon, what do you think you wanna do? Like, you know, year 1 is projects 1 and 2, year 2 is projects 3 and 4, right? Or maybe you don't necessarily have to follow the prioritized list. You could say, well, as commissioners, you know, we know we have money for this next year, so we're actually gonna move this one to 2026. But we don't really have any money for this project, even though it's number 1, so we wanna move that to 2028 because we're gonna look for grant
Very
funds
good.
for that one, right? So you can kind of play with the implementation part of it as commissioners. So, so that breaks down, I guess, the CIP part, so.
All right, I'm through derailing you, but that was very good information, appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. So I guess, like I said, the first thing I wanted to just go through is each section of the growth policy that we're kind of required to develop goals and objectives for. And then after we're kind of done looking at that, I actually have a list, I just have a printout here of some infrastructure areas for the CIP that I thought we could just go through each one and just jot down needs or projects that you guys know of for these different areas like airport, bridge, road,
Okay,
you know, whatever. So I just kind of get a list started of needs of projects, so. All right, the
this
first
is a work session, we didn't think we'd have to work.
Oh, yeah, no, this is a work session,
I'll
so
take a
you
note.
guys gotta stay awake.
Robert, this man really is Jeremy Thaddeus. He is not the commissioner from the highway.
He actually is.
Mike always mistakes me for Shane Fox from Blaine County,
Yeah.
cause we
I'll
kinda
never
do look
forget.
alike.
I'll never forget how I went up to that guy and I called him Jeremy and shook his hand and all that. And he says, I'm not Jeremy.
I don't know, guys.
We do kinda look similar though, after you brought that up, it's like, yeah, after you brought that up, we started looking at each other, like, I guess we do kinda look a little, we said, both got a beard and a little bit of
I
gray.
think I
and-
made that mistake too. I said, hey, there's Jeremy. No, that's not Jeremy.
That was after I made such a fool of myself.
All right, so the first section is land use and community goals, growth goals. And so we usually have several goals within that section, which is usually like, you know, goal number 1 is usually provide for the orderly development of Blaine County. That's the goal, right? And so then under that, and I'm just pulling an example, this is the one we did for Blaine County, and so I'm just pulling from that right now as an example. And so, you know, an example of objectives is provide for compatible development between the rural and urban transition areas close to established communities. So for instance, that would be the rural area around Roundup, for instance, right? And so one strategy for that, you know, might be development regulations within the planning area boundary around Roundup or something, right? Working with the city of Roundup and the planning board, right? That might be one example of a strategy or an action.
Now, that's an interesting one to talk about.
And-
That represents something we need to do, but currently we have no building codes or anything for.
Right, and so and I know Roundup, and one thing we'll do is we'll coordinate with the growth policy that Roundup just got done completing. And so we'll pull that growth policy into this discussion too, and we'll discuss that in the Muscle County growth policy. I don't know if they did a future land use map around Roundup or not, I'll have to look
I
at it and
haven't
see.
looked at theirs.
If not, I know you already have a joint city-county planning board. And so I think it would be fairly easy for us to develop a future land use map that includes the planning area around Roundup as part of the Muscle County growth policy, which then would be the basis for any future development regulations.
Okay.
That you would maybe eventually do coordinating with this. So the easiest way to do a coordinated effort like that is to have a joint city-county planning board, which you guys already have a joint city-county planning board. So you've already got that piece done. And so under state code, you could technically develop development regulations in that planning area around Roundup, because you have a joint city-county planning board.
Okay.
And so you kind of already have that piece in place, and so then it's just the next step of, okay, do we have a future land use map? Then, once we have a future land use map, then we can develop a zoning map. I don't want to call it zoning, but.
I know, but ultimately, something like that
Right.
has to be thought of.
Yeah, and then development regulations that go along with that mapping, so. So that's one thing, and then, let's see, and some of these are kind of, keep in mind that some of these are I would like to call them touchy-feely objectives, like, you know, working with Roundup and Melstone and on, you know, growth and development, you know, through, you know, in their planning areas or something, you know, stuff like that. Like,
Sure.
there are policies that just say, we as a county are going to work with these communities as a policy to assist with growth and development or planning issues, right? And so there's a lot of those types of things in here too.
Okay, but you do wanna do that.
Right.
You know,
Right. And then also in this section, usually we go, you know, make sure that the county subdivision regulations are updated as necessary with legislative changes, right? So that's a strategy. And then evaluating subdivision proposals, which is required, evaluating subdivision proposals, in compliance with the growth policy, subdivision regulations, you know, any other floodplain regulations, stuff like that. Is there anything else besides, kind of development regulations? I know we had talked about like a community decay type ordinance or something like that. We could stick something like that in here as an action plan.
Yeah,
I think
that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, that's one of the
We
biggest
need to
complaints we
address
have is people coming in and saying, my neighbor's got a junkyard, you know? Then that ties into the other, well, you can't do anything unless you're zoned, but it's something to think about, you know?
Okay. And then, we kind of talked about development regulations, and I think the easiest thing to start with is the area around Roundup, is kind of start with that area. And then, you know, if that goes well, you could look at doing something for the county potentially, or an area of the county. Like for instance, Lewis and Clark County just got done, they just did zoning in the Helena Valley. Like, you don't have to zone the entire county. You know, if there's areas you see issues with, you know, you could implement, you know, those things in that specific area.
Dean
Yeah,
Creek
I
comes to
think-
mind.
Right.
Yeah,
Issues in Dean Creek there's a lot of commercial, well, there's some commercial businesses there that, you know, are sort of straining the roads and,
the same way with the number 4 road and West Parrot Creek where all the Amish people live.
so there is an Amish element, you know, here, it's a good thing, but, those are where we've been running into our biggest question marks when people say, you know, and we ultimately say, well, unless you have a special district or a zone or whatever.
Well, so I might encourage you, so Carbon County just adopted countywide, I don't think they technically call it zoning, I think they call it development regulations.
Okay?
Isn't that what they
I
call it?
like that.
How did
And
they-
so they don't really call it zoning, they call it development regulations, so they didn't necessarily do like zoning districts, I don't think,
Okay,
across the county. They just put in place a development review ordinance that says, you know, you're allowed to do this, this, and this on your property, but then anything other than that is a conditional use permit.
was it
So-
voted in or did they do a resolution for that?
No, the commissioners just did an ordinance.
Okay,
Actually,
So you might, that might be something you could look up, is Carbon
that's a
County's-
start. I mean,
It's a
you know,
start.
that's a, yeah.
it would be.
And it's not, so they, like I said, they didn't do like zoning districts where they actually went down and said, okay, all this property is gonna be residential, this is gonna be all ag, this is gonna be, they didn't do that, they just said, we're just gonna do this development review process for the whole county. And it's, you know, you're gonna be allowed to do these permitted uses, and then anything outside of that is gonna be a conditional use permit, where you have to
Which
come-
is subject to approval.
where you have to come to the planning board and there's a
That
public
is
hearing.
perfect.
That's
So,
When you think about that with some of those businesses on Dean Creek, and they will probably would have been granted, but at least, but makes conditional as conditions, that might be fixing roads or, I mean, you know, what do they call that, impact fee? I have no idea, I'm totally ignorant, but I think that's where we're headed, because we
Okay.
don't want to zone.
yeah, when I saw that Carbon County did that, I immediately thought of you guys. I was like, man, that might work.
We'd really like to pursue that.
Yeah.
We'd like to
Might be a
do some
start
more
anyway.
research on that. What
So
they did.
it might be like, maybe we work with City of Roundup and do maybe actual zoning around the City of Roundup, but then outside of that,
See, I think
develop this
this,
development review
I think
process.
the city of Roundup has already thought about that.
And I have to review their growth
Because she
policy.
talked about,
I'm
you know,
guessing,
industrial here and,
so I'm guessing they have a future land use map. If they should have. If they didn't, they should have done.
but we want to contradict that.
You wanna- so I mean, we can essentially, as long as they did it in their growth policy, you don't need to you don't need
Yeah.
to redo it. You can basically, we'll just have a portion of our growth policy that says the city of Roundup has already reviewed future land uses within the planning area boundary around their city. Here's the future land use map from their growth policy. And then that way, it's showing that you guys are coordinating with each other. And when the joint planning board, if they get to the point where they want to do zoning around Roundup, then it's in both growth policies. And now you could more easily develop that zoning,
Excellent.
around the city, so. Alright, trying to think if there's anything else. I think those are the couple of things we've talked about over the years, is the community decay and development regulations. I guess we did talk about building permits a little bit over the last couple of years. Is that something that you guys?
Well, I'm just gonna give you my sort of high-level thoughts on that. I could not believe that we didn't have a building department with adopt something similar to the Uniform Building Code, I don't know what they call it now, for building standards, but we don't.
Well, and most counties don't.
And the argument is, well, if you do that, you're gonna have to hire somebody. But it's but what the downside of that though is that you have a lot of substandard construction going on. So it's something to think about, you know. And there's an old saying, just because you have a requirement and you don't have enforcement, does that mean you don't have a requirement? It's a thought. At some point, I think if this county continues to grow, there's gonna have to be some building standards.
So, I'm gonna toss in here. If there were a building inspector, or an applicable building code that was being enforced, perhaps it's something where we don't need our own, but we could contract with other smaller communities around and have one kinda, that covered multiple counties. As a result, we could spread the cost out. Here's the kinds of issues it would help us to solve. One, it's gonna make the structures safer, it's gonna increase their taxable value because they're actually gonna be something that you can turn around and sell someday, as opposed to just slopping down, a trailer on the ground somewhere with no foundation or something, because you'll never be able to get financing for that if they wanna sell it someday. So it will help from that angle. The other thing, as we're dealing with issues with subdivisions, et cetera, and people basically subdividing willy-nilly, because we know what's happening around this county, okay? Well, really, is it gonna do any good for them to try and subdivide if they have to get their building inspected, and we go out there and we say, hey, wait a second, we have to examine the foundation before you put your house up. You put a foundation down here, man, this has an ag covenant on it, you can't build a house here, right? We'll know about it right away. Now, it won't catch everything, but it'll catch most things.
Yes.
And it'll stop a lot of the nonsense going on that we have going on right now with, land usage, illegal subdivisions, incredibly substandard construction. But that's my thought. I think it should be something that this county should make a priority in our growth policy.
I like that.
Well, and, we definitely could put it in there as a, objective and action item. The growth policy is just that, it's a policy, it's
Yeah,
not-
this is one area.
It's a guiding
As we
document,
grow, we wanna make sure we're.
It's something that you wanna look at.
It's a fluid
But it's
document.
not-
We can work with it.
Yeah, you're not gonna, it's not something that's gonna say you're required to do this, just cause you said it in your growth policy. It's
No, I
just something-
understand.
Yeah, so,
But it's, part
but
of
if
that
it's
growth
not in the
policy-
growth policy, then it's gonna be harder to do, cause most, people are gonna be like, well, you didn't say you wanted to do this in growth policy, so how can you know?
Right.
So anything like that you feel like you wanna look at, let's get it in here, so that, you can continue to look at it, and then somebody can't come in later and say, well, you didn't say this in the growth policy.
We're gonna blame this shortfall on WWC.
Which is, well, and the other kind of related to that though is, that growth policy is sort of a roadmap for the future.
Mhm.
If it's utilized the way it's intended, we don't want it just to sit on the.
It's something we should, yeah, exactly, it's something we should refer to every once in a while.
Thinking about whether or not in the future you're gonna wanna have some building standards is worth doing.
So then moving on from land use, the next section is housing. a lot of the same things from the land use section will go into this section too, like making sure you have updated subdivision regulations, and working with the city of Roundup on, assisting, with affordable housing type projects or whatever, right? So, we'll massage stuff in here. The building permits thing, right? That could also go in the housing section. Development regulations. So you'll see, a lot of these are go into multiple sections too,
Okay.
so we'll keep those moving forward. On the housing side, I mean, is there anything else you can think of that we haven't talked about that, I mean, it's a little bit harder for counties on the housing side. Cities, I feel like, are easier because they can really focus on affordable housing projects because they're a smaller, it's a small community versus a county is this large geographical area, and how do you really focus on affordable housing type? It's really in your standards, right? It's in your development, maybe future development regulations and your subdivision regulations. How do you promote, affordable housing
Right.
type projects, right? Or a wide, what we like to say is a wide variety of housing types, including affordable housing, because I mean, you might have some projects where it's like, yeah, this makes sense to have larger lots, bigger houses, not so necessarily affordable. And there's other areas, it's like Roundup, right? Close to infrastructure, smaller lot sizes with city water and sewer, annexed into the city around, that kind of thing. Those are probably more affordable type projects, right? So, so just think about those things. We don't, like I said, we're not hashing everything out today, but I'm just trying to get you guys to think about these things as we start this process. And so if you think of anything,
Well, the only thing that jumps out at me with that one is, homes on the range. So that's, they're gonna be seeking grants for housing. I think it's in the city limits, but it's was it
is there a bill? Isn't there a bill?
Muscle Shell Housing Authority or something like that? That's a board that's under our jurisdiction.
Senior housing.
And, but it's like maybe potentially gonna be like a $14 million project. But the idea is that the existing facility is aging and they're gonna need to build a new one, and there's like 55 residents or something.
3-story.
3-story, but it got us thinking about the whole idea of the lack of housing we got. We were saying, well, wouldn't it be great to increase the size of that facility, to increase the housing capacity?
Right.
And I know that's not directly related,
No, that's perfect.
but that's kind of one of the big.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's perfect in here. There's stuff like that, stuff that I'm not aware of, or Greg's not aware of, that things that you guys know that you need to address or are working on right now. Those are the types of things we need to know.
But
And
the whole idea
we'll
of
review the old
developers,
growth policy too, and I'm sure there's a lot of stuff we'll pull over from the old growth policy that's relevant still, but, yeah.
well, housing is a limiting growth factor here. We've got people for the sheriff, for the hospital, for the ambulance, they just got no place to live if they come here as we're trying to expand.
Workforce housing, basically.
Yeah, but yes, that's what I'm looking for.
That's the same, everybody has the same issue.
Schools, yeah.
We're working with Red Lodge on their growth policy right now, a review of their growth policy right now, and, that's the same thing, it's just workforce housing. Everything's too expensive in Roundup, and people who actually, who have a teacher or emergency services type person, or even a retail type person, they can't afford to buy a house in Red Lodge, right? So, I'm sure it's the same thing here, so.
Classic supply and demand.
Common theme, so, around the state right now. All right, the next section is economic development goals. Again, a lot of this is, interrelated with some of the other sections too, as far as regulations. But is there any, you guys work with SMDC quite a bit on economic
Yes.
development, right? So continue that, obviously.
We do have one project in the line called the Weir Building.
Mhm.
Weir Building Revitalization. And that's, retail, what do they call that, mixed use. That's one thing, we're upgrading our fairgrounds, as you're aware. We're trying to plant seeds for economic growth, but honestly, it's like, well, we're not really that up. We have no long-term strategy, we have no, this would be an area that would really be food for thought for us. You know.
Okay. Well, and like I said, we'll come up with stuff too in here, and then we'll all go over it together, so.
So maybe how other counties have done things and.
We anticipate it being kind of a bedroom community of Billings.
Right,
And so in order to attract those kind of people, it's going to have a quality of lifestyle that would attract them. And those kind of people are gonna wanna be able to take their dog out on Old Park and do events down at the fairgrounds. And it's not like we're looking for big industry to move in here.
sure,
But make it a very pleasant place for someone to live or retire.
sure.
So that's why we're concentrating on the Weir Building, on fairgrounds, the Bear Collins area, the flooded area. All of those things would contribute to that.
One other thing that's kind of an anomaly. You know, the guy was gonna put in or is working on putting in all these windmills. He had an arrangement, to sell his power to a company that's looking to build a data center in the Snowy Mountains. But he said it's like a close to $1 billion data center that'll potentially need 40 full-time employees, many of which the target would be in Roundup. So, and that's kind of like pie in the sky stuff, but when you're talking growth,
Right,
something like that might actually be good for our community. Higher paying jobs, you know, but then again, we gotta have housing, we gotta, you know, and you know Lewistown is growing leaps and bounds where, you know, they've got a real challenge with to try and house their workforce.
yeah, Lewistown's got definitely an interesting situation over there, they got the missile upgrade stuff going
Yeah.
on.
Which could affect us too, which we need to think
Right.
about with the growth policy.
And then they also have that big company out of Germany that's wanting to come in there and build a huge manufacturing
Yeah,
plant at the airport, and they're gonna need, I can't remember what the number of employees was,
2,000.
yeah, so it's a huge number of people, and Lewistown doesn't have.
it was like 500, then they were thinking 3,000 for this Sentinel
Yep,
thing.
yep,
But we're gonna feel some of that, and so part of our growth should maybe at least consider